Kevin Sampson, Picture Lock. I am talking with Jim Hemphill, the writer-director of The Trouble with the Truth. Jim, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for coming on the show. I always like to start at
Thanks so
the
much for having me.
no problem. I always like to start at the beginning. When did you first fall in love with film?
Um, from a very young age, the first movie I ever saw actually was, strangely enough, when I was 3 years old. My parents took me to see the movie Tommy with The Who, which is a very extreme movie for a 3-year-old child to watch. I guess they just couldn't get a babysitter or something. But, literally my first memory is of a movie, is sitting in the theater watching that movie and seeing Tina Turner as the Acid Queen and Anne Margaret rolling around in baked beans. It's a very strange, crazy movie. But I was completely mesmerized by that movie that I saw when I was three. And then I think the second movie I ever saw was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which completely terrified me with the talking trees and all that kind of stuff. So right from the beginning, from the age of three, I was really hooked on movies, and it was like all I ever wanted to do was go to movies. And then as I got a little bit older, I started to actually realize there was someone making these things. There was somebody behind the camera putting them together. And so I really was thinking about wanting to direct movies from a pretty young age. I think probably from around 7 or 8 or 9 years old. I remember being conscious of Clint Eastwood as a director and him being somebody who I really liked. And so I was pretty obsessed from a young age, and I'm not a very well-rounded person. I've kind of just always been in love with movies, and that's been my thing my whole life.
I love that because that's me too. Like when people talk about sports, people are talking about the Cavs currently in the finals. I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. It's only movies all the time. I think we share.
Yeah, right. I'm the same way.
I think we share kind of a similar passion in terms of film criticism. So you started out more on the film critic side before going into directing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was it was sort of a fluke a little bit. I mean, when I was in college, I went to film school at this place called Columbia College in Chicago, and while I was there, I pretty much was only thinking about being a filmmaker. I wasn't thinking about being a critic or anything. But I started writing film criticism, just papers for classes and things like that. And then by kind of a series of coincidences, I wrote this piece on Walter Hill movie called Trespass that I was a big fan of, that ended up actually getting published in a Chicago paper as a review. And so that kind of led me to this idea that, well, I love movies so much, maybe I can get paid to actually sit and watch them and write about them. And I've kind of ever since then been on this dual track where I go back and forth between filmmaking and film criticism. And it's kind of difficult in a way because the one thing I don't like about filmmaking. I love almost everything about it, but I don't like the fact that it's so all-consuming that it takes me away from watching other people's movies.
Right.
And then by the same token, when I'm working on film criticism stuff, it sort of takes me away from making my own movie. So there's always this push and pull.
I can totally understand because in creating a film, I mean, you have to put your all into it, and you can't do anything else at the time. All right,
Right.
so kind of getting into your film, The Trouble with the Truth. This obviously it wasn't your first feature, but maybe your first feature with big names. Can you talk
Yep.
about your first feature and just how that prepared you for The Trouble with the Truth?
Yeah, well, the first feature I made was a very, very low budget, down and dirty affair. It was a horror movie called Bad Reputation, and it was a movie that was done, basically with a crew of three people. I mean, there was me, my camera guy, and my sound guy, and between the three of us, we did everything. And it was a very kind of homemade affair. It was almost like just kind of a glorified student film that we made, shot on digital video, not even high def. It was like mini DV with no money, and as you say, Trouble with the Truth in a way was sort of more my first quote unquote real movie. But what Bad Reputation did in terms of preparing me was I just by necessity had to learn like every trunk in my car in the morning. I was the one sending the schedules to the actors at night and all that kind of stuff. So by doing a movie that way, you kind of learn every job, and it's horrible. It's really difficult to do. It's difficult to keep everything in your mind straight, and the movie can kind of suffer. But I think what that gives you then, when you make a movie on a slightly larger scale, is you not only you since you know how to do everything, it gives you more respect for everybody's individual jobs, but it also keeps you from being able to be tricked by people. I mean, like when someone says, if someone says to you, "Oh, you can't do it that way," you kind of have a little more ammunition if you've done it yourself. You can say, "Well, I know you can do it that way because this is the way I did it before." But basically, my first movie, I feel like, was in a way just an extension of film school. Like it was really learning how to make a feature, and I made a lot of mistakes, and I still like that movie a lot, but it was a movie where I didn't know what it really took to make a movie. So I was straining against my resources the whole time. I was way too ambitious in terms of the kind of movie I was trying to make without having a lot of money. And I think that impacted Trouble with the Truth, in that I wrote Trouble with the Truth specifically to be a kind of more manageable movie to make. Like I knew what things are difficult and what things are easier to achieve and all that kind of stuff. So it helped in a lot of ways, I think, making a low budget movie like that before moving on to Trouble with the Truth.
Yeah, that's great. Because we always have to start somewhere. But I think with the Trouble with the Truth, I mean, obviously the things that you learned. This is just a well polished movie. So let's go ahead and get into it. So can you just give us a little synopsis about what the film is about?
The Trouble with the Truth is about a divorced couple played by John Shea and Leah Thompson, whose 20-something daughter is about to get married. And so that sort of is the occasion to spark them getting together, being reunited, basically, after a couple years of not really talking, not really seeing each other. And over the course of this night, where they've gotten together for dinner, they basically discovered that they have a lot of unresolved feelings about their own marriage and relationship and the relationships that they've had since, and basically realizing how complicated it is, and that maybe they still have these strong feelings for each other, which is a problem since Leah's character is still is married to someone else now, and John's life is going in different directions. And the movie's basically just kind of about how messy and complicated relationships can be, and hopefully it's kind of a both touching and funny look at that, if I pulled it off, what I was trying to do.
Your film can be compared, of course, to My Dinner with Andre or Linkletter's Before Sunrise and Sunset. All of these films, they have a real-time pace to it. So did you draw from those films for yours, or was it, was it a struggle trying to write that real-time pacing?
Yeah, those movies were definitely movies I had in mind. And in terms of you talking about asking whether it was a struggle, most of the struggle was just kind of in my own overall confidence, I guess, just to be confident that this would work. And what those movies gave me was that confidence, because I watched My Dinner with Andre and I watched Before Sunrise and Before Sunset. I don't think Before Midnight had been made yet. And I watched those movies and saw, okay, this can be done. This can work. People have done it, and it's worked. And Before Sunset, especially, really kind of helped me just with the overall structure of the movie. I mean, the thing that Linklater is great at, and Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, who co-wrote those movies with him, the thing that they're really great at is just finding the right balance between scenes where they're talking about things that are really meaningful, and then the kind of little digressions that you need in between those to make it feel natural. Because when people are talking, they're not necessarily talking about heavy stuff every minute. They're talking about movies, or they're talking about food, or they're talking about sports, or whatever. And Linklater is just brilliant at knowing how to balance that so that it's the right amount of the meaningful and the trivial, and it doesn't become either too contrived and too overly dramatic, but it also doesn't feel like he's just messing around. And so I really kind of studied Before Sunset and studied the structure of the rhythm, and that really was a good model. And I watched a few other movies that were heavily dialogue driven or took place in a compressed time frame. Like a movie that I watched that actually doesn't seem all that similar, but had a big impact on me, was this movie Ron Chell directed, Play It to the Bone, with Harrelson and Antonio Banderas, which more or less takes place in like one day, and a lot of it takes place in a car with a few characters, and it's very dialogue driven. That was an influence. Clint Eastwood's movie, The Bridges of Madison County, I watched for the same reason. So and even The Breakfast Club. I tried to like sort of study every movie I could that took place in that kind of real time frame with a handful of characters that was very dialogue driven, and just kind of watch them to try to figure out like, okay, how did these directors make it work? Because all of those movies, I feel like, have an energy to them, and they don't get boring or static, even though it's basically just people talking in a room.
Right. Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I thought was really, man, it was just awesome with the film is the dialogue. And so a lot of times with the dialogue between John Shea and Leah Thompson, it's not about what they're saying, it's about what they're not saying. So could you just talk a little bit about how did you strike that balance? Because I felt like it just felt so natural. I could relate to the characters.
Yeah, I don't know. I think some of that, I have to say, I got lucky in terms of how expressive John Shea and Leah Thompson are, because I think some of those things that are not said, I don't remember exactly, but probably some of them were actually in the script, and I was able to cut them out because you sort of got what was going on behind John Shea and Leah Thompson's eyes. I mean, John is like great at both of them. Really, are great at thinking on screen, which is kind of a funny thing. I mean, they tell you that books are better than movies for showing people thinking. Like, you can't show people's thoughts on screen, but I actually don't really agree with that. And I think, John, for example, my favorite scenes in the movie are actually the couple of shots where they're not talking. There's the scene with John in the bathroom towards the end of the movie, and the scene with Leah where he gets up from the table after they have their little argument. Those are actually some of my favorite parts of the movie. But in terms of striking that balance, it was just kind of intuitive, and I think it changed. I wrote a few drafts of the script, and as you're writing, that probably changed a little bit. I would reveal more or pull more back or whatever, and then that process continues even through shooting and through editing. When you're editing, sometimes you take things out because you don't want it to be explicit. You want people to be able to kind of read into the faces a little more and think about what isn't being said, and or what when they talk, they're saying what the other person, they're presenting themselves as they want the other person to perceive them, but not necessarily as they really are.
It's funny you mentioned one of my favorite scenes, but kind of in a different way. So camera movement can be totally difficult as a director, knowing when to move the camera. And in a story like this, what I really enjoyed was that the characters only moved when it pushed the story forward. And you just talked about when Leah Thompson was sitting at the table after her and John kind of had like a little blow up. And I loved how the camera does, it goes around the table to reset the 180-degree rule, and at the same time, it like refreshes the conversation as John comes back in from the bathroom. Can you talk a little bit about that moment? That I thought that was awesome.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, yeah, that I'm glad you noticed, and it was done exactly for that reason you're saying in terms of the 180-degree rule, because that scene, that's the longest scene in the movie. That is them sitting at a table for at least a half hour, might even be more like 40 minutes. It's a very, very long scene. And so I knew if the camera had to stay on one side of the table, it would get, static and boring. And I was always thinking about, how do I keep it visually interesting without getting show-offy? Because, as soon as you don't want to be throwing the camera around all over the place, because it is a movie about the dialogue and about the characters, and you don't want to be distracting. But if you don't do anything with your camera, it's going to start getting boring really fast. So I saw that scene, it was just in the script. John gets angry, gets up from the table to go to the bathroom. And so that was like a scene where I saw a way to kind of motivate moving the camera, because it could kind of move around and, move around with him as he gets up to leave. And, she's by herself, and it could kind of kill a few birds with one stone, because I could reset to the other side, like you're saying, and also in a way kind of put a little bit of extra emphasis on her emotional state as she's going through different things. And so, basically it's exactly what you saw in that was exactly what I was trying to do. So I'm glad that it worked.
It definitely did. You're watching or listening to Picture Lock, and I'm talking with Jim Hemphill, writer-director of The Trouble with the Truth. Jim, what was it like working with Leah Thompson and John Shea?
It was fantastic, and I think that was the biggest difference between my first movie and this one. Was the first movie was all very inexperienced actors. It took place in high school. No one in the movie. It was every single person. I think it was their first movie, and that was great too. I mean, that was fun in its own way because it was my first movie. So we were all kind of learning how to make a movie together. But with John and Leah, there's this level of professionalism that they bring you that is really helpful and great if you're an inexperienced director like me. And in fact, what was also kind of interesting is that John and Leah are both directors. Leah has directed some TV movies. She directs now she's on a TV series on ABC Family called Switched at Birth, and she directs some of those. John has directed theater. He's directed a lot of plays. He's directed a couple of movies. So they're both really good directors. And in a way, I was a little bit afraid of that when I started knowing that, because I thought, oh, are they going to be sort of, trying to tell me what to do? But it was actually just the opposite, in that they weren't telling me how to do it, but they helped me figure out how to achieve what I wanted. And they were very, very generous in terms of if I needed extra takes of something, they would do it without complaining, because they know, being directors themselves, that when you get in the editing room, you want as much as you can possibly have. Right. But the amazing thing about both of them being the professionals that they are is it really was an insight for me into how an actor can add an extra layer of meaning to something that you've written, because there wasn't a lot of improv in terms of the dialogue. I mean, they basically said the lines as they were written, and yet they could do different takes, and those lines would mean something completely different depending on how they played them. I mean, we would play around with the scenes where they would play some takes, sort of lighter and happier. They would play some where Leah would cry and she wouldn't cry in other takes of the same scene. And so it sort of became what Leah calls emotional improv, where even though they're saying the same lines, they're playing them differently each time, and it can completely change the meaning of the scene and also add depth to a scene. So then it's kind of great as a director, as a writer-director, because you get credit in a way for the scenes being a little richer than they probably were when you wrote them.
Man, I love that emotional improv. That's awesome. One thing I was thinking about with their chemistry, it just felt so real. And I know sometimes directors will use different tricks to, have them go out before in rehearsal or whatever. Did you use any tricks, or was that just all them?
I have to say that was all of them. I didn't have to do anything, because they actually had worked together before a long time ago, something like 10 years earlier. They were in a mini-series together where they played husband and wife. And John was actually Leah's idea. Leah was cast first, and I knew the movie was going to live or die on the chemistry of the two leads. So I wanted Leah to be involved in casting the guy. And I asked her, who would you like for this? And she had 4 or 5 actors who she had worked with, who she thought would be great. And John was at the top of her list. And as soon as she said his name, I thought it was a great idea. So I thought John Shea was a great idea. I always loved him. And the cool thing about it was that, in a way, the process of making this movie, there was this weird kind of connection between the content of the movie and John and Leah reconnecting after all these years, because they had made that movie together 10 years earlier, but weren't necessarily, and liked each other a lot, but weren't necessarily close. They only know each other when they work together. So when they came to make Trouble with the Truth, they were reconnecting after not having seen each other in years, just like the characters were. And we shot the movie in sequence. So they were sort of becoming more comfortable with each other as the characters were on screen. So the chemistry was just kind of natural. I got very lucky. I didn't really have to do anything. It just, and they just kind of brought it themselves.
All right. Jim, a few more questions. I'm enjoying this conversation, but I know I'll have to let you go. One question for those that are filmmakers, young filmmakers trying to make that low budget film. What advice would you give them?
Well, it's there's so many things. I mean, the first thing that's obvious is, I would say, first of all, watch as many DVDs of low-budget movies with director's commentary tracks as you can. Watch movies by Jim Jarmusch, Hal Hartley, Linklater. Watch a lot of their earlier movies, the ones that are that are low-budget movies, and watch the commentary tracks. Actually, my favorite one is there's a DVD of the movie Following, Christopher Nolan's first movie, and it's got this whole commentary track where he just talks about how he made that movie for no money, and it's great. He gives you all these tips, like shoot scenes on rooftops because you can get visually interesting, but you don't have as much street sound interfering, and just all kinds of things like that. So I would watch things like that. I watch Roger Corman exploitation movies with the commentary tracks because they're filled with ideas about how to get stuff on screen without resources. So that's the first thing I would do, and then just write something. If you can make a low or no budget feature these days. If you can get your hands on a camera and a laptop. It's not easy, but you can make a feature, which is something that when I was first starting out, when I was in film school, we were still shooting everything on film, so it was really expensive. It was kind of out of the realm of possibility to make your own movie. Now you don't need permission the same way, but I think write something knowing what you have, and write something write as much to keep yourself in control as you can. So don't write big crowd scenes in exteriors unless you know how you're going to control that. Write things that are interiors. Write things if your mom owns or works in a restaurant. Write stuff that takes place in a restaurant. Just try to think of as many ways to take advantage of things as you can. That's sort of my first thing. But the biggest thing is really just to try to shoot stuff, because you learn so much just by doing it. And I studied film my whole life. I went to film school, all that stuff, but it was nothing compared to what I learned when I actually made my first movie. So really, if you can find a way to get your hands on a camera, even if it's just the cheapest camera you can get your hands on. It doesn't have to be an Arri Alexa. You can shoot a good looking movie now with relatively inexpensive cameras.
Man, I think you just killed that answer. I mean, that was brilliant. The DVDs, listening to the commentary tracks, I'm gonna have to do that myself. All right, so how did it feel to get a glowing review on your movie from Roger Ebert?
It was pretty great, I have to say. That was one of the highlights of the whole experience, because when I was I grew up in Chicago, and that was where I fell in love with movies. So, in Chicago at the time I grew up in the 80s and 90s, it was really just a hub of great film reviewing. You had Roger Ebert was writing for the Chicago Sun-Times. Gene Siskel was in the Chicago Tribune. There was a guy named Dave Kerr who was great. Jonathan Rosenbaum, the Chicago Reader, all these great critics. And I really learned a lot. Ebert was probably as big an influence on me as any filmmaker because he was the first critic I ever read. I watched their show religiously as a kid. So when the movie played in Chicago, in a way, my whole goal in getting the movie into a theater in Chicago was to get a review from Roger Ebert. So when I woke up that morning and looked on RogerEbert.com, and there was a 3.5-star review on there. I mean, it was hugely gratifying. I sort of said to myself, well, if nothing else ever comes of this movie, at least I have that.
Right. No one can take that away from you.
Exactly.
All right. So where can people find The Trouble with the Truth now?
You can watch it, if you want to stream it, it's on iTunes or Amazon Instant or Vudu. And it's also out on DVD. You can get it online at a lot of places like Amazon, Best Buy, Walmart, all that kind of stuff. And it's in stores at Barnes & Noble. And if you live in an area where they still have the Family Video chain store, I think all those stores rent it. So those are basically the best ways to check it out. And hopefully, I'm hoping it'll be on Netflix streaming later this year, but we haven't gotten it on there yet.
Awesome. How can people follow you or find you on social media or follow the film?
You can go. I've got a website, jimhemphillfilms.com, and that also has connections to my Facebook and Twitter pages, so people can find me there. And that website has information not only about Trouble with the Truth, but I also, as you said, I write about movies. I interview directors, and so I put the interviews and all that kind of stuff on there. So yeah, jimhemphillfilms.com, or they can find me on Twitter at Jimmy Hemphill.
All right, Jim Hemphill, writer-director of The Trouble with the Truth. Thanks so much for coming on Picture Lock today. I appreciate talking with you.
Oh, thank you so much. I had a great time, and I really appreciate your kind words about the movie.